Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition, a special edition of Big Hero News. And yes, I know there's something going on with my camera. It's glitching. We've just spent an hour speaking to Dr Sanjana Hattotuwa about all sorts of stuff, including David Seymour, Winston Peters, and protest in New Zealand right now. And right at the end of the conversation, my camera started doing this. So if you're watching, you can see it. If you're listening, ignore what I've just said. I apologise. I don't have time to look at it now. It's doing funny, glitchy things, but we're all here. Chewy, do you want to give us any feedback about the conversation we've just had?
It's a cracker. I mean, I say at the end that I think it's really important for people to understand the sort of conversations that go on, the way that politicians can sort of take things out of some pretty extreme environments and make them more palatable and just shift the boundary of what people are willing to do. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's an important, very important chat.
The conversation began with me asking Sanjana if he'd come on and talk to us about the David Seymour comments around Guy Fawkes. Man, it's glitching even worse and worse and worse. I'm sorry about that. And then we moved into conversations around protests and also about Winston Peters' comments around fucking bathrooms and sports. And that was sort of where it is, and I think that's just where we'll get into it, Chewy?
Yep. Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us today. This is obviously a pre-record. We will be back live Monday night from 9 p.m, but enjoy this special one-off talking with the research director of the Disinformation Project, Dr Sanjana Hattotuwa. All the best. We'll see you Monday. Well, he is the research director at the Disinformation Project. He hasn't got the letter, the information, Chewy, about coming with a beard, but he is in Dunedin. So we got to give some props to Dr Sanjana Hattotuwa, who joins us today. Kia ora, Kaz. How are you?
Kia ora, Pat. Good to be on.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for joining us. This is a bit of a special for us. We don't normally do Friday nights unless we get a really special opportunity. Now, I don't know whether that special opportunity is you or whether it's the news about David Seymour. But whichever it is, a special sort of one-off conversation to have a chat about a few things going on in the news at the moment. So thank you for giving us some time. We're recording this Friday afternoon. We really appreciate you jumping in.
Good to be here.
I think what we'll do is let's just start with the News Hub story about the David Seymour situation. Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued to talk to you about this and talk about what the flow-on effects from this kind of language is. But also, I've seen a little bit of commentary today, guys, where people are saying things like, don't get caught up in Seymour's words and miss the point that he's still wanting to cancel like five ministerial things and Human Rights Commission. Like, don't make too much of his words. Don't get caught up in that over what he's trying to do as well. And I think they're all interesting conversations to have. But first of all, just for clarity, and you know what? This was really hard to find yesterday. I went looking for this quote yesterday after I heard it. I don't know if ZB scrubbed it from their website. Maybe I just missed it, but I couldn't find it. But News Hub, and to their credit, you know, we've had some criticisms of old Jenna there, not criticising ACT. So credit where credit's due, Chewy. They got it, they have it, and they talk about the situation that David Seymour has put himself into yesterday. It's only a 90-second story. Let's just have a look at that to start off with.
ACT leader David Seymour has come under fire for his calls to abolish the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, suggesting he'd send in Guy Fawkes. It comes after the ministry spent $40,000 of taxpayer money on a leaving party. With more on this, we're joined by political editor Jenna Lynch. Jenna, what exactly did Seymour say?
Yes, David Seymour taking aim at the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, castigating them for wasteful spending, not just for that 40 grand blowout on the leaving party, but also for spending $121,000 on Prezi cards over the last year. Seymour says they want to abolish the ministry altogether, but then he went on News Talk ZB, did a radio interview and took it a step.
Although, sorry to interrupt, can I just say, Jenna Lynch still does get in there a couple of things of ACT policy as well, about being critical for the right reasons. So she still does get in there. But yes, then she goes on to him getting on News Talk ZB.
Radio interview and took it a step further, a step too far, insinuating he wanted to blow up the ministry.
Well, in my fantasy, we'd send a guy called Guy Fawkes in there and it'll be all over, but we'll probably have to have a more formal approach than that.
Deputy Prime
Probably.
Minister Carmel Sepuloni has gone all in, calling on Seymour to apologise and accusing him of a pattern of behaviour, saying he is constantly race baiting when it comes to Māori and Pacifica issues. David Seymour refused to do an interview with News Hub on the matter, instead sending us a statement which shows just how seriously he's taking this. It reads, News Hub needs to focus on government waste instead of waging war on humour. The only thing that statement reveals is David Seymour's level of maturity.
All right, then we're Gina Lynch.
So there you go. There's the story from News Hub. Christopher Luxon has responded. Christopher Luxon said, when asked about the Guy Fawkes, so the ministry will be all over, he says, I don't agree with that, right? Said Luxon, and the comments were raised when the comments were made by an audience member at a school hall meeting. The point is, I'm not the leader of ACT Party. I'm the leader of the National Party. Don't imbue me with comments from him. Asked, how much are you going to let David Seymour pull the strings when you lead the government? Luxon stressed that there are no deals being done with minor parties, but that we have worked constructively with ACT in the past, and there's a lot of goals that we might be aligned on. Any coalition he assembled would be more stable than the coalition of chaos on the other side, he said. Anyway. So that was what was said by David Seymour. That was what was responded by Christopher Luxon. And I guess what we wanted to get you on for, Sanjana, is to talk a little bit about the words that he said and the connection perhaps between political rhetoric and violence. I think we see that in the States quite a bit. Chewy, you sent me a story, and I don't have it here, but I will bring it up, about not RNZ, but the ministry actually having to call police recently because of people causing trouble in the areas. So how about, as we love to do, it was the same day, but I mean, just to be clear and fair, it was before the comments. So you can't put those comments together that because of him, they went there. But there are issues. I'll bring it up in a second. We'll have a look at it. Sanjana, what do you think, first of all, about the comments, and what about the rhetoric that he's putting out there? What it could lead to, might lead to, is danger of leading to? How would we say that?
So at the Disinfo project, we look at this kind of speech, and whoever who makes it, in a specific framework called dangerous speech that was proposed by an American academic called Professor Susan Benesch. I mean, it's widely known. It's being used extensively around the world, including the stuff that I did before I came to Aotearoa, looking at how online hate and harm instigated on social media platforms resulted in or contributed to genocidal acts in Myanmar against the Rohingya and in Sri Lanka against the Muslims. So this has been a concern of academics for well over a decade, actually. And if you go back to, you don't need to talk about technology, right? You go back to Rwanda and look at the role that Radio Milcolin, RTLM, played. And you know that media amplifies speech that, if in a particular context is uttered, almost inexorably and invariably leads to offline violence. And the point about dangerous speech and why we use it is because it's defined as any form of expression that increases the risk that its audience will condone or commit violence. So we are not saying that it directly causes it, but it creates the conditions or a permissiveness for those who listen to say, hey, that's cool. Maybe we can go and do something about it, and to take it very, very seriously. And to be very fair, Pat, maybe not necessarily the intention of the speaker, but creates that environment where you have the license of the audiences to go do things that in this particular speech frame are absolutely horrific. And I just end by saying that dangerous speech, it's really not academic. It's quite easy to understand. Mm-hmm. There are 5 ways that we kind of examine, speeches or quotes or phrases or sentiments like this. We look at the message, what is being said. We look at the socio-political and the historical context within which that message is being put out. We look at the medium. So the medium can be, now it's a bit more complicated. Is it on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or RNZ or TVNZ or, where it goes up? We look at the audience. I mean, who is it intended towards? Who does it resonate with the most? And then finally, we look at the speaker. Who is saying it? What is their identity? What is their background? And so on and so forth. So those 5 things are what we use. And generally speaking, dangerous speech is precisely that. It's not something that you would countenance without significant concern about what it possibly leads to and gives life to.
So what I hear you saying is it doesn't even necessarily need to be a call to action, a direct call to action. It's creating the environment. Like I think about, in my head, I think about the Sarah Palin crosshairs on places that she wanted to win, meaning we're going to target these areas. And I don't know if that's been proven to lead to Gabby Giffords being shot in the head, but there's certainly some people saying there's a connection that Sarah Palin, there is a vibe that she created that could have given someone the idea that could have been what it is. And for a politician, for a party that's, I guess, within New Zealand's context, what our alt-right would be, certainly if there's no other party that you would put in that class, whether they are or aren't, that's up for debate, but certainly would be the one who, if they was, to have those followers, to talk about blowing up a ministry of brown people, creating the environment for someone, let's be honest, who's probably a little bit off the rails, who's not straight in the head, kind of going, oh, my leader said that. I guess they've given us the okay.
Well, I mean, there are I have at least 2 responses to that, Pat. One is that we all have our hot mic moments, right? We all say things that we either in later life or immediately thereafter, or when questioned about it, not necessarily regret, but learn to reflect on. And I think that's a quality of a mature political leader, where it's not really the mistake that you made in a certain utterance, but it's perhaps the maturity to realize that what you said is wrong, is harmful, and can lead to unintended consequences that actually you might not be entirely partial to, seeing in Aotearoa as well. So, that's an important qualification, because he, in that news clip that you played, he was asked that question. And it's more concerning for researchers like myself around the answer that he gave to the question, which is in a sense independent of that original thing that he said. And the second answer that I want to give, Pat, is to make very clear, the listener of this program shouldn't take it to mean that this individual created the context, right? I mean, you are speaking to a gallery, you are speaking to a context, which is why dangerous speech is so important. You're speaking to a lot of things that Aotearoa thinks isn't present in the country, like structural inequality and structural racism and hatred and harm against the Maori and Pacifica communities. I mean, I certainly haven't seen, as a person of color coming in and studying this, the kind of rigorous debate and acknowledgement that these kinds of issues exist. They're not some figment of someone's imagination. So it's not as if the speaker created the context, but he's speaking to a context without really helping think through what can be the solutions to that as well. I'm sorry, I don't want to hog this, but you raised another point, which is you brought up Sarah Palin, but I think we can fast forward to something that academics like myself have been looking at, which is the Capitol Hill insurrection, right? I mean, there's this whole really interesting conversation around the degree to which, if at all, the social media conversation contributed, and Trump's tweets in particular contributed to it. And I think there's really, I mean, I want to bring this up because it's official testimony of the 6th of January, inquiry, the commission that looked at it. And there's a tweet. I mean, the commission had a tweet, and there was an employee. It's testimony, right? There's an employee who said, and I quote, "I had been begging and attempting to raise the reality that if we made no intervention into what I saw occurring, people were going to die." And remember and recall that this was pre-Musk, right? So this was, a very different kind of Twitter. And there's an interesting admission around what people within the company saw and were begging leadership to do to kind of prevent what actually ended up occurring. And there's academic research that also really interesting stuff that suggests that there's a really strong correlation between Trump's tweets against Muslims and the offline violence against Muslims in the United States. And that's all public domain academic research. So causation is in correlation, but there is very strong evidence pre-social media and particularly after social media, which suggests that dangerous speech never stays online. It invariably impacts the manner in which people's attitudes, perceptions, responses, and behaviors go on to kind of enact what is invited.
And online would also include, I mean, this is a comment on the radio, but then that turns into online rhetoric. So it's the same sort of thing, whether it's...
Hey, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a media ecosystem that, you can't distinguish between what is broadcast and what is online. It's all one thing, right?
Yeah. Chewy, did you have that article? Did I see you in your window? You've got it. Do you want to bring it up?
Yes. So, yeah, this is the morning of...
Yep.
So
this is before his statement, before his comments.
I believe Seymour's statements were at 1 p.m. But two people walk into the ministry, filming, harassing staff with questions about how much they in the ministry are spending. Apparently, they work nearby to the ministry. I wish they didn't play their faces.
And that was based around the $40,000. And look, to be honest, I hear about someone who got a $40,000 going away and then a $12,000 welcoming to another department, and I think that's fucking stupid, right? I get it. I get that that's stupid, but it's the next action as to what the environment we're being created, that's been created by comments like David Seymour is creating, that's making these kinds of emboldening, which is a word we've heard a lot since Donald Trump came into our lives, emboldening these people to walk in and do this kind of thing. So now that he's said whatever it was, send Guy Fawkes over. I'm not being too dramatic and saying it's going to happen next, but what is it? What new layer on top is going to then cause these people to be in harm's way, to have more complaints, to have people who are objectionable come in and harass them? I don't know.
I think, when Seymour makes these comments, I always get the vibe. He's always had like a high school debate club vibe to him, right? Where it's all an intellectual exercise and it's just very contained on the one issue that he's talking about, and other aspects don't come into it. So he's blameless. Of course I was joking. And he won't acknowledge the fact that the things that he says as a political leader have weight. And yes, they spent too much money. There's a process for that. The money was paid back once it was pointed out. There is a protest. What someone like Seymour does in a position of leadership can encourage vigilantism, or people seeing themselves as vigilantes, because the proper channels don't cut it. And you've got two dudes that feel emboldened to walk into a government department and just start throwing their weight around. This is also coming from the leader of a party that doesn't believe that we should have a firearms register.
So let me ask it like this. So how much responsibility does someone in a position of power, as Chewy's pointed out, like David Seymour, have for the actions of others that it may embolden? Is that what we need to figure out, Sanjana? Is that how the politicians and people...
We don't need to figure it out because it's known, right? What is considered to be humor by Pakeha in this country is a permissiveness and a license for violent harm and rhetoric that anybody who is not Pakeha, who is an immigrant, who is a person of color, who is a Wahine Maori, would not get away with. This is not an academic debate that we need to nitpick around. We know the rhetoric against Tusiata Avia. This is not, we don't need to get too academic about it. This is structural racism. This is white supremacism. Let's be very clear about what we're talking about and not bandy around the bush. We don't need to be politically correct in articulating our concern that the political leaders of this country get away with rhetoric that nobody else would, particularly if they're Pakeha and cisgender male. This is not a technological consideration. It's just a matter of fact. So let's be very clear about it. And the second thing I want to kind of very, very clearly say, Chewy, is I think you bring up a good point about, it's funny, right? It's ha-ha, And, there's a word that academics use. It's called polysemic. And, I don't want to kind of get this to go over all listeners' head, but the very simple thing is that you take a meme, you take a joke, you take something that's later said or said when it's originally said as a joke or in a humorous way. And then you look at somebody like Nick Fuentes or the whole range of the far-right characters who sadly now define American politics in the main. And the presentation that something is humorous is what they do to get away with the instigation of hate and violent harm and rhetoric. So it's also what we call plausible deniability, Chewy, because it allows you to kind of say, hey, we didn't mean it that way.
Yeah, I was just joking.
We didn't want you to go and do it. Yeah. We were joking. And so it kind of allows you to do it, but not do it at the same time. You know what I'm saying? So, it's really worrying in that regard. And this is always what we've seen in terms of a script or a playbook in other parts of the world and in other contexts and throughout history as well, where you enable something, but then you say, hey, I was joking, I didn't mean it seriously. But it's that also that invisible ability because of who you are to get away with what you're saying that I think is also quite telling.
I think there's one important point, very important point to make, first of all, very, very important, is that Sanjana talked about, his academic words going over the heads of the listener. I tell you something, it won't go over the heads of the listeners, but it will go over potentially our heads because, the listeners are far smarter than us and we are the dumbest people in the room. So I just want to make this clear that if it's about the listener, whatever terms you want to use is fine, but you might need to dumb it down for me and Chewy. Sorry, Chewy, I just thought that was an important point to get out there. You go, sir.
On the plausible deniability, as someone that spends a lot of time online, that's something that I've seen over the space of the last 10 years, is you see people being radicalized essentially through edgy memes and jokes. And I think that's very much in the realms of what David Seymour thinks he's doing, is that he's being edgy and he's funny. Suddenly NewsHub is policing humor and not the words that he's using.
But whose humor, Chewy? I mean, like, let's not let him or anybody get away with the responsibility of the words that you say. Whose humor is this? Who's laughing?
That's a shit joke. As a comedian, it was a shit
But
joke.
who's laughing, right? Because there will be people who are laughing, right? There will be people who agree that this is a jocular comment and shouldn't be, the speech police shouldn't be out now to get humor. I will guarantee that clips of this program will be used in a manner that suggests that we are, or I am in particular, indicating or suggesting that there should be censorship or that there should be new hate speech regulations or frameworks, because this is the immediate end of where this all goes. And nobody's articulating or, saying that. But whose humor is this?
Yeah, but I think this is the point. And often when we're talking about this, Sanjana, I like to put it into a different context to see if it still fits. Imagine if Rawiri Waititi had said this sort of thing. A man with a big face tattoo that people try and put into a pigeonhole and say, radical. If he had said that he was going to send, Guy Fawkes along to something, it wouldn't be seen as a joke then, it would be seen as a threat. So when you say whose humor is that, I think that's the perfect example.
Yeah,
I agree. I agree.
There's such a double standard out there. How many stories were spun up about Tory whānau over the past couple of months, right? And those were in the news cycle for ages. I started a stopwatch to just keep track of how long the media keeps this story in the public eye. I bet it isn't half the time.
Let me ask you both this question then as well, because I kind of hinted it at the start. How important is it to highlight the words that he's saying, what he actually said, and the obstinance to not back down? That's another part of this. Be like, fuck you guys, it's just a joke, basically. Versus taking our eye off the fact that he wants to get rid of 5 ministries and the Human Rights Commission. In other words, could this be a squirrel? And we're now looking at the words he's saying that people are going to debate, and we're all forgetting about the huge amount of harm that David Seymour could do to New Zealand with legislation. Either of you?
You go.
Well, I would say, if somebody says what they believe them.
Yeah.
It's a very simple thing. You don't need to be, splitting hairs. This is the forward presentation. He was given an opportunity to clarify. Pat said you said back down, but when you kind of pitch it in that way, it's not something that politicians would do, right? So it's not backing down, but it may be clarifying. It's maybe seeing strength in articulating a position that expresses regret. Saying that this is not what he meant and it was a hot mic moment or whatever. I mean, there are so many ways that you can save face because politicians are not like you and I. They have a constituency that they have an image around. So the real politic in me, would accommodate all of that and, say, you could have gotten out of it in a manner that was less flippant. But I would say just believe what Mr. Seymour says. Believe him because he's been saying it quite repeatedly. So I think that, we don't need to be too critical or too skeptical because this is a what you would call a leitmotif. This is a constant refrain. And in that sense, Pat, it's not a distraction, really. It's more a different way of saying what he really means and believes.
And it's no longer a dog whistle, is it? It's a foghorn, Chewy. He's not being subtle anymore.
No, I think this is where Carmel Cipolloni's comments are really on the ball, is that they call out his pattern of behaviour. Because it's not just this is a one-time thing. He's constantly going back to this. And again, when you are in this position, when you have this media platform, when you have the leadership of a party that people believe in, you have an extra responsibility. And he doesn't seem to take the correction. He doesn't have the self-reflection to sit back and go, well, people keep on taking my words out of context. Maybe I should be more careful with the words. That suggests to me that he's saying exactly what he wants to say.
So intent is really
exactly the
intent is really hard. I mean, to kind of project or to ascertain and determine what intent was. So we always give the benefit of the doubt, right? Which is why the dangerous speech framework helps because, whatever that your intent was, it's going to be understood in a particular way. So Pat, you referred to it's not being a dog whistle, but a bullhorn thing. I mean, these are debatable things, but the fact of the matter is he said what he did. He was given a point at which he could have clarified it, but he stood by his guns, right? So that is, from the dangerous speech framework, reinstatement and an entrenchment of one's initial position, which from the point of which we appreciate it is not good, for anybody to have that position because of what I said. I mean, I really do mean it. It's not as if, we can either one of us can say that Mr. Seymour really wants to see somebody go and do what he said needs to be done in his fantasy to the target that he, articulated. And I'm not saying these words because I don't even want to kind of repeat the harm, right? So that's why I'm, paraphrasing it because repeating the harm would also may also give it life. But it's just the permissiveness, the enabling environment that you create and entrench without qualification or calling it out as wrong, that this speech is understood by us as dangerous. It gives greater potential of leading to offline harms. Again, I stress, it's not a causal link. It just leads to the greater propensity of it occurring. And who wants that?
Yeah.
I mean, I come from a country where we've got sick of it. I mean, why does Aotearoa want to? I just don't understand. I just don't get it. It's a very basic human thing for those of us who come from elsewhere in the world who don't enjoy what you guys take for granted.
Yeah.
Why the fuck do you want this in your country? I don't get it.
Well, speaking of
I
in the
believe
country,
I don't get it either.
No. Speaking of in the country, and you guys have both brought up protest in this conversation, Sanjana, I'd like to just bounce this little one off you as well. And again, thanks for being with us today because you guys kind of got a lot of prominence, the Disinformation Project, around the Wellington protest. Yeah, I'm not saying that's all you guys are about, but certainly that raised the profile of the Disinformation Project. And there's a story out today talking about councils under fire as protest becomes more heated and more polarised. A couple of segments from here. The protests, this is about protests happening in over at Environment Canterbury. The protests we are seeing in the post-COVID environment are different as people are much more polarised in their views. They are entitled to their views and the right to protest, but it is definitely getting more heated and polarised, and there is not a lot of listening that goes on. Protests had initially been around imposed lockdown and vaccine mandates, which of course is now morphed. Local councils are now a particular target for protesters, is what's being said. This is the same interviewee. There was a strong presence of freedom rights and sovereign national activists at the Waimakariri district last month's hearing in Oxford to consider quarry and landfill resource consent applications from Woodstock Quarries Limited was adjourned after protesters became verbally abusive towards staff and commissioners, an Environmental Canterbury spokesperson said. And this is part of the meeting. Outbursts included accusing Mayor Dan Gordon of treason. Doesn't that sound like from the January 6th playbook, guys? And objections to the inclusion of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in Council's annual plan. Council staff has also been protesting an unusually high number of Official Information Act requests. The difficulty for police was in balancing the rights of people to express their views and to protest while ensuring public safety. Again, talking about the environment that's been created in New Zealand at the moment, since that Wellington protest, it seems that we are getting more of a mirror of what we're seeing at school board meetings, January 6th, these kinds of things in America. I just wanted to give you a chance to speak to that, Sanjana.
Well, I think, a couple of things. I mean, it's good to talk about Jan 6th in the United States, but it's also not very helpful because Aotearoa is not the United States. And there's no path dependency or prophecy that suggests that we should go there or we will get there. However, what we have seen, and it's also in a sense independent of the parliament protest, is the fact that the pandemic led to greater networking and stronger networking and more screen time, and then globally and domestically led to conspiratorialism that existed long before the pandemic to get more connected. So what were disparate communities became more connected, and you call this a shared psychosis. You found community in your psychosis, and then it kind of migrated away from the anti-vax, anti-mandate commentary and content. Mid-2022, in fact, the step change pact wasn't really, interestingly, everybody refers to the parliament protest, but in a sense, the step change away from the vax-related stuff to the content that you showed up on the screen was after the expiration of the COVID-19 traffic lights framework. Right. So up until then, so that's a really important point, right? Up until then, it was related, the parliament protest was also about the mandates and the vax. But the shift to what, the news reports are talking about, there's the UN, the WEF, the broader conversations about WHO, the 15, 10, 20-minute city thing, the whole range of conspiratorialism that I think is not really reported on in the mainstream media to the degree that it is really impacting local government. It's hitting councillors hard. It's hitting mayors hard. And these are these are people like you and I who don't have the resources of the beehive, who don't have EAs, who don't have vast social media teams to help them deal with now the industrial grade hate and harm that is attacking them. Right. And this is something that we study quite a bit. And we studied, the migration away from anti-vax mid-2022. And now it's dominant, right? I mean, the day we are recording this, I can tell you, Pat, that, there are two big conversations. I mean, in a sense, really quite interesting. One is about the fires in Maui, in Hawaii. And there's been this deluge of content coming into domestic disinformation landscapes from the United Kingdom, from the United States in particular, that make no mention of climate change at all. But it's this constellation of completely mad conspiracies that one of the dominant things is the 15-minute city. And they believe that either it was a directed energy weapon or some sort of way in which the fires were engineered to recreate a 15-minute city. Right. So, I mean, this is really going into our realm by saying, Pat, that I think you highlighted that section about the police not knowing quite what to do. But this is something that I know that within the Disinformation Project, we really struggle with because it's a real challenge for democracy in Aotearoa moving forward, where the right to protest is sacrosanct. The right to network against policies of the government is a foundation of democracy.
Yeah.
And it's so rare, that, shouldn't take it for granted. But now you have the infiltration of really sophisticated strategic actors who are piggybacking on that, what you would, for want of a better way, say that left activism, capturing and instrumentalizing that vocabulary of, democratic participation to create these really hostile, antagonistic engagements and networks, which are really debilitating the work of local government right up to national government. And the path dependency of that is actually what we then can say we see in the United States, where it's not just at the federal level that democracy is crumbling and flailing and failing. It started off at the state level, at state legislatures and the local government level. So if we are to draw anything from the United States, it actually maybe the lesson is not the 6th of January, but a longer reflection and a more nuanced one around how it got to where we find the United States today. And academics call this effective polarization. That's what's happening. That's what's really going on. It's profoundly worrying. And we are going to see more of this in the future.
Should we just say, Chewy, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of, because you've mentioned 15-minute city a couple of times, that the 15-minute city, my understanding is to give people in a city kind of a 15-minute trip to get access to all the essentials that they need. Yep. And I think it's using public transport and bikes and stuff within 15 minutes, whereas the conspiracy theorists see it as a way of controlling a population, putting them into like an area where they can be controlled to get rid of their cars.
A ghetto.
A ghetto where they'll have to then be stuck and can't leave. That's what the conspiracy theorists see. But what it is actually trying to give us all access to everything within 15 minutes of where we live. Is that a fair synopsis?
That's a fair synopsis, but, again, not to complicate matters altogether, because disinformation works best when it has an iota of truth or a grain of truth in it. And part of the concern that I think, we can have is that there is an element of surveillance, right? You have CCTV cameras in London, for example. That is one of the most surveilled cities in the world. So we talk about China as being a surveilled country, but you have the United Kingdom as having one of the most, the highest concentrations of CCTV cameras per capita. So it's not good to have a surveillance architecture, whether it's the West or the rest. It's not good to have an unaccountable way in which populations are monitored, even for the best of intent, because it may lead to things and ends that will be instrumentalized by less democratic individuals and governments in the future. So there is legitimate inquiry necessary around the technologies that undergird what is being proposed. Pat, what you said has a technology and a foundation, right? That's kind of what these cities are all about. Now, that conversation is vital, essential, and really integral to what should be a robust debate based on facts and evidence as it is presented in Aotearoa. But what is actually rolling out in Aotearoa is nothing to do with surveillance and population control or anything that the people believe it is to be. But people are so angry because you're taking away their SUVs, you're taking away their cars, and people think that you're coming to kind of put them into what they see as open-air prisons and contain and control and not allow them to travel. And, this goes into a lot of conspiratorialism. But Pat, the very simple thing is quite simply this. The people who are spreading this, Pat, are actually a few anywhere in the world. So there's a power law dynamic. They know what they're doing and they know they're lying. A number of the people actually who go on to attend these meetings may not know the facts as they actually are. And so that's also the difference and distinction that we make. We are charitable towards the people who believe,
it's like the
but
disinformation.
We are not.
It's like the disinformation doesn't in New Zealand, and it's like the people who attended the protest. The people at the top, the instigators, they know what they're doing. The people at the bottom receiving the bad information are on some level, until some point, sort of almost innocent bystanders.
Because it's a compelling story, right? It's a compelling narrative. We're living in anxious times. People are, finding it hard to live. There are genuine concerns about the future. And so this kind of stuff that, you're going to live in a a prison, and the demon is the demonized entity is always the Far East or other kind of draconian countries. Do you want to live like that? Do you want to give up your car, your freedom, and so on and so forth? So these are they always result in anger, and then you really can't have a debate or a discussion, which is really sad place and a bad place to be or to get at.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit very quickly, because I know we kept you longer than we already said we would, about Winston Peters' bathroom policies today. But before we do, Chewy, do you want to jump in on this one at all about the conversation around protests and what's happening with them at the moment? I mean, I don't want to take anything away.
Look, I have one thing to say about, you bring up a valid point about things like the 15-minute cities, and there is legitimate criticism that can be has to be considered, right? And because these disinformation agents use that kernel of truth, that often means that if you do have a legitimate concern about something, you get lumped in with them.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, even if you are completely bananas, you might be doing harm to something that you're actually concerned about anyway, and amongst all of the other crazy things.
But Chewy, that's a really interesting point, because that's democratic decay, right? Because you have to really think harder than what is required to articulate a position that in years past you could have kind of said, hey, I am in principle opposed to this, and let's have a talk about it.
Yeah,
right?
But now I don't want to be associated with these people.
Yeah,
So
but it's also them using you and your voice as kind of evidence of what they are saying, right? So you have to say, hey, I'm not that, hey, I'm not this, but I am actually interested in this. And it just becomes exhausting. And the point of the matter, Chewy, is that how many of us really want to engage with that kind of, negotiation involved? It's a chilling effect, right? It's a chilling effect.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it actually rolls into our last topic very, very well. And again, we do thank you for giving us some time today, because, Chewy, you just used the phrase, I wrote it down, when you get lumped in with. Winston Peters at the moment is lumping in a bunch of people together for votes, as in my opinion, he uses them as useful idiots to get re-elected whilst he's going to do nothing. So we can see that, for example, the anti-vaxxers, anti-mandates, they are now looking for new ways to roll their grift, and they're moving into things like climate change, and they're moving into things now like trans issues. So Winston Peters comes out this week with this ridiculous idea policy. And let's be clear, guys. I mean, I won't say it like that, because that sounds like you're going to agree with me. You may not. The public funding for sports one is a non-issue, in my opinion, because federations around the world are making decisions based on that. FINA has made a decision, athletics has made a decision, rugby's made a decision. All these groups are sorting this out, and they're making decisions for themselves. So really what this is about, in my opinion, is it's about the bathroom situation that Winston Peters is pushing very heavily. And I wanted to ask you about this, Sanjana, because, at the Disinformation Project, I think some of those groups that are now pivoting will be pivoting into this issue if they weren't already there, to do with, trans rights, what is a woman, that ridiculous question, those sorts of things. And while we've got you here, can we grab your thoughts around what you're seeing with Winston Peters at the moment, floating an idea that's never going to get passed, that wouldn't make any difference, and that is purely looking for people to vote for him before he turns on them and they finally see his shell game, which is anything to get elected?
But you've answered my question. It's like, what can I add to that? Apart from, again, just to speak to the dangerous speech framework that we always go back to, because it's not a partisan thing that we're looking at. And I think that people love to hate us because they think that we are partisan. When, it's our struggle to also articulate the fact that actually what we are looking at is speech. It's not partisan. It's a dangerous speech framework that populism plays into. So everything that you said, Pat, I can't and won't disagree with, but it plays into things that are the moment, that after March this year in our landscape changed dramatically as a consequence of an individual who came into this country, and by all accounts at the time of and the day of recording will arrive again in a couple of weeks' time. So that step change, which we have a report on, is a very serious one. We got a deluge individually, the founder and director of the Disinformation Project, and myself, but also institutionally, for what we said we were looking at. And it was a genocidal targeting of the trans people, following from academic research in the United States that looked at a comparable hate and harm targeted against those identities. We put it out, we put out the grounding, we put out the evidence, but it hasn't addressed the kind of emotions that March triggered, that has led to a context where a lot of things, including sex education, the GLBTIQA identities, and the trans people and their identities are being targeted in a way that we haven't seen prior to March. Not to say that it didn't exist, but there was an accelerant, and again, that permissiveness and space. So it is concerning that populism leading up to the 14th of October is latching onto this, and what it may lead to, both in the time that we have before the election day and the kind of sluice gates that this opens to say that it's okay. It's fine to talk about it in this manner.
Chewy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's almost a perfect storm, right? I think this was always bubbling away in the surface on social media. You know, I've been following the white nationalist scene for a long time, and it was always, they were their own little crazy village, and it was always too bluntly offensive to attract too many people, right? It was always a small little village. And then when COVID came along, and you have this critical mass of people using social media, you have basically an event that in recent memory has never happened. We didn't have a historical frame of reference for it at all, you know, locking down completely, breaking everybody's social, safety net. And, you know, you spent most of your time online, right? And there's all of these messages out there. There's all of these disparate groups, and they're all coming together under the one umbrella. And you had this intense, almost a boot camp of, this is the way we speak, and this is the rhetoric that we use, and this is the cause that we have. But also, I've got this other cause as well. So it's not just anti-vax, it's the Jews, or it's the trans community are only doing this to abuse kids. It all came under that tent. And as much as people have moved away as the COVID framework fell away as well, there are still people that have been radicalized by this whole thing. And we're seeing it everywhere. In every aspect of our society, people get angrier, quicker over smaller things. It's directed at governmental structures. It's directed at authority figures. It's directed at shadowy cabals of elites and all of that sort of stuff. And they might be Māori elites, or they might whatever. It's ratcheted up the rhetoric, the way that, you know, the fact that this mayor got accused of treason. There's a reason that the word treason is used. It's because treason has a death penalty.
Yeah. So
when someone's dropping that over a resource consent issue about a landfill, like that's bananas. You know, here in Dunedin, there was a person who ran for council, turned up for a meeting, and went on a like a 20-minute rant that said that the centre city looked like a concentration camp. It's just people have gone crazy. And for a lot of people, I think, you know, I said this around when Fire and the Fury came out, a lot of people didn't know that this was happening until it was on Parliament lawn.
Yeah.
And they're like, how did this happen? You know, that's how it happened. And these when Winston Peters and David Seymour carry on talking the way that they always have in a dramatically changed environment, and then act surprised when the response that they get is different, more extreme, potentially more violent, you know, they're not standing back and taking stock and going, well, maybe I need to pivot a little bit here.
But we can see that even if we drop down a few layers. I mean, we talked about Nicola Willis this week being on Plunkett's show, being asked about, you know, women's sport and that kind of stuff. I mean, they're not, National's not, hasn't got the same kind of rhetoric as ACT when it comes to these areas of social issues, but they're in the same chapter. And so that when someone pushes back against them in an area that all of a sudden they're uncomfortable with, they're like, no, these aren't our questions. It's like, well, actually, this is the environment that you have opened up to have these questions asked to you. What are you expecting?
Yeah, I don't want to kind of... Sorry, Trey, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, perfect example of that is Luxon distancing himself instantly from what Seymour said. Those aren't my words. That's not what I would say. Yes, but everybody knows that you have an agreement. You're going to pair with ACT. It's a foregone conclusion. So then you need to talk about that power dynamic. But he doesn't want to. He just goes, "That's not me. It's not my party."
No, but it's not just ACT. Probably and New Zealand First, who we've just started talking about to do with fucking bathrooms. And I wrote something today, and I won't read it out, Sanjana, but basically the point about the Winston situation, the reason he's using people who want to fight this fight as useful idiots is, and this, I'll read out what I wrote. The posts that I've been putting up, and Chewy's seen them as well, of like trans men who are looking more manly and masculine and tough than anyone in this chat right now. More they look more like males than anything else. So the posts I put up with pictures of them. Under this new law, people are pushing back, saying things like no men in women's bathrooms, or I don't want to see penises. Under this proposed law, this won't change because trans men who look male, and many have penises, will now be forced to go into women's bathrooms. If you're a female and you see a bearded, balding, muscled person full of testosterone eating female bathrooms, you may not know if that person was born male and shouldn't be there, or was born female and has transitioned. So the law's not even going to work, let alone anything else. So all it is a way for him to trick people into voting for him while he continues to punch down and give others the space to legitimize their punching down.
Yeah, Pat, I'll agree with that last point, because I think that there is a danger of doing what we are doing right now, which is to analyze critically this individual's statements, taking it at face value that that person has thought through what they are saying.
They haven't.
Obviously. When this is populism needs to be taken and understood as populism, with no anchor to anything other than the moment.
Yeah, well, we know he hasn't thought it through, because if he'd thought it through, he would have realized that he's just banned, he wants to ban baby boys from going with their mothers into their mum's changing rooms. That 18-month-old boy can no longer, under his rules, technically, go into the... So you know it's not thought out. Absolutely, 100%. But, but it also people need to know. But people need to know it hasn't been thought out to then see the shell game. That's the point.
Yeah.
Anything else you guys want to add into this? I mean, you know, here's the one thing I wanted to add, guys. This is for people. This is again about Winston again. And look, what I hear you saying, Sanjana, is almost don't give him too much credit. I just wanted to show this one thing to maybe wrap up. This is Winston Peters in October of 2021, right? This is what he was saying about the vaccine. Kiwis want their freedom back. We've been let down by this government's lethargy and a minority who refuse to get vaccinated. People need certainty, not a plan, not uncertainty. Sorry, certainty and a plan, not uncertainty and spin. This is Winston Peters, remember, if you're listening and you can't see it. Start with, quote, no jab means no dole and no parole. In other words, if you don't get vaccinated, you won't get any support from the government and you won't be let out of prison. We've had enough of the hand-wringing, right? So that's what Winston Peters was saying. 4 months later, Winston Peters was saying this. He did not support vaccination mandates, saying he questioned their retention with New Zealand relatively high vaccination rates. So to your point, Sanjana, he's not to be taken seriously. I don't like the term populist because it makes it sound like it's popular, like the majority. I understand what it does mean, but it's just the only person that Winston Peters is thinking about is Winston. People are being sucked into his rhetoric because they think it suits their ideology, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend, in this case, is definitely not my people. That's what
there
I
is,
wanted to
though.
say.
There is a. I mean, this is getting too long, but there's a really interesting dynamic in the disinformation ecologies and landscapes where what you're saying isn't new. It's in fact the dominant understanding and critical appreciation, exactly how you said it. So there is an acute realization in the disinformation ecologies that isn't, in a sense, reflected or mirrored in perhaps mainstream media, because you don't need to say it. But in the disinformation space, you need to say it, because there's this real contest now between some of the individuals who are setting themselves up to be candidates and new parties at the 14th October general election, where they are now concerned about the gravitational pull of, say, a Mr. Peters, which would take away from what they say as the more authentic kind of voice of freedom that they would represent. So just to make it very, very clear, Pat, because we don't have the time, the net result of what I'm seeing is that the individuals who are setting themselves up against Mr. Peters are far more extreme, are far more violent, are far more violative in their rhetoric, are far more conspiratorial, are far more informed by far-right ideologies. And so that is what Mr. Peters is, in a sense, contributing to, perhaps inadvertently, on account of being what he is, doing what he does, and saying what he does. So it's a really interesting dynamic that is playing out in the disinformation ecologies, which I appreciate that many, if not most of the viewers or listeners wouldn't be looking at. But as a student of politics, you really have to be concerned about, because it has an impact on the democratic fabric of Aotearoa, far beyond the 14th of October.
All right. Well, listen, I can see my camera's about to glitch out. I don't know why, but Chewy, do you want to? We've been far too long, and I genuinely thank you for your time. I promised you a much shorter time than this, so that you've stayed with us has been great. But Chewy, I don't want to cut anything off you want to wrap up with either, because me and Sanjana have just had a long spiel. Anything you want to finish us up with, mate?
No, I'm just glad to be included.
I'm just happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pretty much. No, look, I think this stuff is incredibly important for people to be aware of. I think, it being in the election cycle at the moment, we need to hold people to a higher standard now, that they shouldn't dip into this. But to do that, you got to know what's going on.
Yeah. All right. Hey, Sanjana, if people want to find out more about what the Disinfo project's up to or anything, what should they do? Go
to our website.
Which is?
Good question. The disinfoproject.org. So THEDISINFO project.org.
Let's do this before we take off, shall we? Like that.
Yeah. There you go.
There you go. Excellent. Hey, Dr. Sanjana Hattotuwa, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate you giving us some time, and we will get this out there and let the world know everything that's been talked about today. So cheers for joining us. And we'll see you at Countdown.
Thanks, man. Good to be on your show.
Thanks so much.